NIA believes all fiat currencies will eventually fail, but the US dollar is likely to win a race to the bottom with the euro. Despite all the problems in Greece, the country of Greece makes up just 3% of the total Eurozone GDP. The state of California makes up 13.5% of the US GDP, with an economy that is 5 times larger than Greece. And with every passing day, there is an increasing likelihood that the state of California will soon need a bailout by the federal government.
The currency is much more flawed in the sense that we have gigantic debts, a huge balance of trade deficit, etc. The Eurozone as a whole is much less flawed. I would suspect that the U.S. will have more problems first, and then the Euro, but who knows?
In an attempt to add fuel to the U.S. dollar rally, President Obama recently proposed a spending freeze, which he promised will help cut down on future budget deficits. The spending freeze, which will begin in 2011, excludes defense, education, as well as programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Obama's proposed spending freeze is absolutely meaningless. Let's say instead of freezing government spending where it is today, Obama actually cut 100% of all government spending down to zero, but kept Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Our country's current annual tax receipts are not enough to cover the spending. That's right. If the U.S. government got rid of every single department, including the military, we would still have a budget deficit from Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid alone. With the baby boomers beginning to retire, the growth in entitlement spending will accelerate rapidly over the next few years. The average American peaks in spending at 46 years old, and the last baby boomer will turn 46 in 2010. This means real U.S. tax receipts will decline this decade at the same time as 1.5 to 2 million Americans apply for Social Security each year, compared to only 500,000 per year last decade. Even seniors who were smart enough to save a lot of money for retirement in an attempt to live off the interest they collect and not to rely on government entitlements may soon find out that they can't afford retirement no matter how much money they have. A senior citizen with an account at Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, or Wells Fargo will now need to have $100 million on deposit just to earn $50,000 per year in retirement interest income.
People look at interest rates from the perspective of the borrower. We all want low interest rates because it helps the borrower. But what about the lender? What about the saver? These guys are getting destroyed in this relationship. You can't have an economy that doesn't reward savings, because you have to have savings. That's where economic growth comes from. That's where capital investment comes from. And until we're able to raise interest rates, we can never have a real economy.
Most economists believe hyperinflation can't happen in the U.S. because rising interest rates will put a stop to inflation. Although a record high federal funds rate in 1980 of 20% was able to prevent hyperinflation, our national debt back then was only $909 billion, or 33% of GDP. Today, our national debt is more than 14 times larger and about 91% of GDP, and that's not including our Fannie-Freddie debts and unfunded liabilities.
Hyperinflation, or a massive devaluation of the dollar, is now unavoidable. We have passed the point of no return. If interest rates stay low and they continue stimulating the economy to try to pretend that things are okay, to try to pretend there's an actual recovery taking root, we will continue to hyperinflate our currency. Now, if they try to contract the currency and raise interest rates, as we already know, our countrymen are dependent on easy money. They're dependent on credit. They're continuing to use their credit cards. They're continuing to borrow for houses, borrow for cars, borrow for anything we consume. Once they raise interest rates, those payments will simply become too much, because we already know that we were exporting our great jobs overseas. So the people we have left in the United States will not be able to afford these higher payments.
In March, U.S. interest payments on our national debt were only $20.8 billion, due to the record low interest rates on our total marketable debt of only 2.5%. Only 3 years earlier, in March of 2007, the interest rate on our total marketable debt was 5%. If the Federal Reserve begins raising interest rates in 2010, by 2011, we could see our marketable debt interest rate rise back up to 5%. This would mean annual interest payments on our debt of over $500 billion, or 23% of projected tax receipts. The White House budget doesn't project for interest payments on our national debt to break the $500 billion mark until fiscal year 2014. We find it shocking that the White House is projecting an interest rate on our debt in 2014 of only 4%. It will be impossible to hold interest rates at artificially low levels for so long. By 2014, we could be looking at interest rates of 10% or higher, with interest payments on our national debt reaching $1.5 trillion or 43% of projected tax receipts. During the Great Depression, 27% of those employed in the U.S. worked on farms. Today, less than 2% of U.S. workers work on farms, and agriculture makes up less than 1% of our GDP. On October 30th, 2009, NIA released an article predicting that inflation would appear next in food and agriculture. Since then, wholesale food prices have risen 6 months in a row. Wholesale food prices rose 2.4% during the month of March, the largest monthly increase in over 26 years. Some of the startling food price increases on a year-over-year basis include fresh and dry vegetables up 56.1%, fresh fruits and melons up 28.8%, eggs for fresh use up 33.6%, pork up 19.1%, beef and veal up 10.7%, and dairy products up 9.7%. If the U.S. defaulted on its gold obligations when it ended the gold standard in 1971, how do we know our gold reserves of 8,133.5 tons still exist? If they do, why aren't they audited on an annual basis like the assets of publicly traded companies? Assuming that our gold reserves still exist at Fort Knox, the value of our gold reserves based on the current price of gold is only around $300 billion. The U.S. budget deficit for the month of February 2010 alone was $220.9 billion. The bottom line is, our gold reserves, if they still exist, are nothing compared to our debts and deficit spending. The U.S. dollar would have to be devalued by 81% for our gold reserves to be worth enough to cover our projected budget deficit for fiscal year 2010 alone. The U.S. dollar would have to be devalued 98% for our gold reserves to be worth enough to pay off our national debt.
I mean, we could easily go back to a gold standard today, but they would have to revalue the gold price to something like $1 million per ounce. Then you can implement the gold standards very easily.
Instead of returning to a sound currency that is backed by gold, politicians in Washington today believe that adding new regulations will solve our problems. They believe the free market failed and the financial collapse of 2008 occurred because there weren't enough regulations.
My question to them is, what free market? The Federal Reserve sets interest rates for the entire nation, basically setting the payments. So the Federal Reserve is involved in price fixing, because we know that if interest rates are low, payments are low. If interest rates are high, payments are high.
The truth is, we haven't had a real free market in the U.S. for many decades. It is impossible to have a free market when the Federal Reserve artificially manipulates interest rates. If we had a free market, there would be no bailouts of so-called too-big-to-fail institutions. AIG would have defaulted on their credit default swap payments to firms like Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, and Deutsche Bank. Wall Street would have lost on their bets and wouldn't have been able to pay out record bonuses.
The fear of failure is a great motivator, and failure itself is the best regulator. If you want to regulate the banks, let them fail. Let them know that they can fail. If we would have let Goldman and AIG and others fail, I think our country realistically would already be through the worst of it. But by saving them, by devaluing our currency, by inflating the money supply to save these banks, all we've really done is save the very institutions that have hurt this nation.
If you would like to be kept up to date on a weekly basis with facts and truth about the U.S. economy and inflation, please sign up for the free NIA newsletter at inflation.us. NIA